Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. If you can take your seats, we're going to kick this thing off. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us today. Hope to have a really good event. Promote some good discussion. Hopefully, some good questions and some good answers. Hopefully, maybe that's aspirational. This event sort of had as its genesis, as most things do, sort of a discussion around a kitchen table over a few beers. And whereas that's usually my preferred venue for having these discussions, it became rapidly apparent to Trevor and I that, number one, we were going to need a bigger room. And number two, we were going to need some people that really knew this topic. And hence, the participation of Canadians for Clean Prosperity. So thanks for joining us, Mark. This is sort of a cooperative event among Canadians for Clean Prosperity, Canada West Foundation, and Bennett Jones. So my thanks to our two partners for all their hard work in putting this event on. We have a wonderful pedigree of panelists today who really need no introduction other than to abide by decorum. So let's kick it off. Trevor McLeod is responsible for the environment policy portfolio at Canada West Foundation. Eric Axford, the Executive VP Business Services for Suncor. Eric is in charge of environment, health, safety, and environment matters and government relations with Suncor. Mark Cameron, who's the Executive Director of Canadians for Clean Prosperity. Mark has a wealth of public policy experience, both within government and industry, having worked for Ontario Power Generation, BlackBerry, also serving as a Senior Policy Advisor to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Thanks for joining us, to both Eric and Mark. We have Mr. Hal Kvisle, President of Fletcher Challenge Energy, CEO of TransCanada Corporation, CEO of Talisman, and now Board Chair of ARC Resources. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Kvisle. And finally, Mr. Andrew Leach, Chair of Alberta's Climate Change Advisory Panel. Andrew is an energy and environmental economist, the Associate Professor and Academic Director of Energy Programs at the U of A. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I'll hand it over to Trevor.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Well, I think it's fair to say that a hell of a lot has happened over the last year on the environment file and generally. Alberta, and not least of which is that Alberta's announced a new and ambitious climate policy. And I think it's an understatement to say that the world or the landscape is shifting around us. So it's really time to take some stock. And so I think if we leave here today with a better understanding of what the heck's happening around us and on the environment file, and what the government has tried to do with this climate policy, I think we'll have been successful. So for my part, I'm going to keep things simple. No more introductions. There are bios on your chairs, so take a look at those at your leisure. No PowerPoint presentations, and we'll just break this into 3 chunks. The first chunk is 20 minutes, and it's really the high-level stuff. I'll ask a question of each panelist. Hopefully they'll answer it, and we'll get going on that. The second chunk is 30 minutes, and it's really designed to have a discussion between these panelists. They all know what they're talking about, and I think that's the real value here. So we'll do that. And at the end, we'll have 20 minutes for questions, and I'll give you the ground rules sort of when we get there. But it's not too early to start thinking of those concise and penetrating questions. So let's get started. So Hal, why don't we start with you? Tom listed some of your bio, and it's clear you have a lot of experience as an executive in the energy sector. I think the audience would benefit from a bit of framing from you on this. If you could just tell us where the industry is, where the province is on the environment file, that would be helpful.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just start out by providing a little bit of historic context to some of the ways that I've seen environmental concerns evolve in our industry over time. If you think back to the 1970s, we had some very significant environmental problems. You'll recall that pulp mills and petrochemical plants were spewing things into the water. We had rivers in Ohio catching on fire from the amount of pollution in them. Here in Western Canada, the energy sector was generally pretty environmentally responsible, but that did not stop some bad events from happening. And at that time, one of the early environmental movements really got going. pointed out these problems, dealt with things like the ozone hole and acid rain, which was a big problem. And some of the solutions that were found back then, people have attempted to apply them to the greenhouse gas, to the CO2 problems that we see today. Today, our concerns are a little bit more refined. At the root of it all are some people that worry that North Americans simply use too much fossil fuel. That's a common concern you'll hear in Europe. And when I attended the Copenhagen conference of the parties meeting in 2009, I encountered that theme many times. The view was just that North Americans are a little too aggressive in their consumption of fossil fuels. But today, the focus, I think, shifts to Asia. Can Asia continue to grow at the pace that it has been while cleaning up its severe pollution problems and reducing its emissions? And we see that CO2 has become a very controversial thing, and I'm not about to wade into that today. Major social changes occur over time. Public opinion changes on things. And if society today has made a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas and CO2 emissions, that's fine. So then we need to think about what are we going to do about that and how do we deal with those concerns? How can we reduce CO2 emissions when the consumption of energy is such an essential driver of the quality of life? And people often overlook that almost every new invention, every new development in the last 100 years requires the consumption of more energy. We do many, many things. We have SUVs rather than compact cars. We have bigger houses, heated driveways, swimming pools. Even my cattle enjoy some heat out in the cattle shed, and that wasn't the case 50 years ago. So a lot of different things. Everything seems to consume electricity or energy of one sort, and as Canadians, we're particularly reliant on that. If in a cold winter we had a major failure on the Trans-Canada pipeline system and an electrical failure in Ontario at the same time, this could create a life and death situation. People cannot survive in -20 weather in a country like Canada without the essential energy that we need. So the notion that we can swear off fossil fuels and shift to renewables is really a bit disconnected from reality. I was at a conference 6 months ago, and my friend Diane Francis was speaking on a panel, and she quoted an environmental activist study that predicted North Americans would be off fossil fuels, not consuming them anymore 15 years from now. And she quoted Moore's Law, which has seen the computing capability of microchips double every few years, and thought that the same thing could happen in renewables. On the other hand, some of you may have read ExxonMobil's most recent energy outlook. And if you follow ExxonMobil's energy outlook, which I highly recommend, over the last 25 years, they're pretty accurate. They do enormously detailed work, and they bring a lot of intellectual resources to bear when they look at this. And I just wanted to quote a couple of things. Exxon noted that global energy demand rose by a third over the first 15 years of this century. We increased consumption of energy by 1/3 on the planet Earth, and energy-related CO2 emissions, not including cattle or volcanoes or anything, but just from the energy sector, rose by 50% over the last 15 years. This is after all the commitments at Kyoto. Exxon is a little more optimistic about the next 25 years, predicting that the demand for energy will rise just 25% over that period. But they predict that the CO2 intensity of the global economy will be cut in half by the year 2040, and that energy-related CO2 emissions will decline after the year 2030. So these are some significant changes in the way mankind goes about accessing its energy, and you know, we have to look at that. Now, we've seen environmental activists oppose many things that we do here in Western Canada. And to some extent, I think this is a result of frustration that they experience. They've tried to convince North Americans in an ethical sense to use less hydrocarbon, and it has very little impact. They've tried to convince governments to heavily tax energy, and governments find that that's pretty unpopular with voters, and so people have been generally reluctant to impose the kind of very high fuel tax that is common in Europe, for example, where the price of fuel is much higher than here. What has been successful are programs to improve vehicle efficiency. They've required manufacturers to produce more fuel-efficient vehicles, and that's worked. And building insulation programs, energy efficiency in buildings has done quite well. But in their frustration, we've seen the activists come out and oppose construction and expansion of energy supply sources, the oil sands, fracking of natural gas, and opposition, of course, to pipelines. So, you know, this is all well and good, but if we were to reduce our emissions in the oil and gas production sector by 100%, we'd reduce global CO2 emissions from the energy side by about 10 or 15%. If we completely shut down all emission-related activity, it would reduce emissions by that much, and I guess the world would run out of oil and gas. On the other hand, with 85% of emissions coming from the final consumer, if you could simply reduce those emissions by 50%, and that's not simple, but if you could, you would reduce global emissions by 40%. So my concluding point here that I'd make in this intro session is that we really do need to focus on the consumption point, and to that extent, I think what the Alberta government is doing has some very good elements to it. Particularly today, if there was ever a time for us to shift from coal-fired to natural gas-fired electric power, this is a very good time to do it. We have ample supplies of natural gas, the price is low, and for the very long foreseeable future, we will never run out of gas as a result of the shale revolution. So that's one good thing that I think comes out of that program. The other is the incentive for every man consumer, for all of us, to reduce our CO2 emissions through the tax system. I think this is a positive thing that the Alberta government's done and shows leadership in this regard. Compared to cap and trade and many other more complicated things, I think this is a sensible approach. So I just leave you with those few introductory thoughts, and back to you.
That's great. It covers a lot of ground to start, and I think it frames it nicely. So we'll get into a lot of those things as we go along. It might make sense to dive a little bit more into the operational side now. Eric, you've had senior roles in both government and industry, and currently have operation responsibilities at Suncor as an EVP. And Suncor stood on the stage at the announcement in November and supported the plan. Can you just sort of give us a sense of how Suncor got there from an operational perspective?
We actually did stand on stage with the Alberta government as they announced this policy, and really for some of the reasons Hal just mentioned, actually, that you have probably heard us over several years advocating for what we've called a broad-based carbon policy that actually gets at the full value chain of carbon, if you want to think about it that way. As Hal just said, shutting down the industry isn't actually going to make a big difference, but changing all of our behavior as consumers will make a difference. And if the actual goal in society is to reduce carbon emissions, you're going to have to go where the carbon emissions are, which is in the full part of the value chain. So, we were quite pleased that the courage of the Alberta government, frankly, to get to a position where they would advocate a broad-based carbon policy. It starts for Suncor with actually a belief that climate change is real. So it took us several years to kind of come to grips with that, but societal trends, all the data in the world, the general consensus of the world's top scientists kind of points out that climate change seems to be occurring and that human-induced emissions are part of that. So, once you accept that, you actually start thinking about, well, what are smart ways to actually become more efficient and effective? And frankly, that's good for business too. So energy consumption is obviously where a lot of carbon is created, and a lot of our own internal strategies around operations and other things are around looking for ways to improve our existing assets to become more energy efficient, to invest in new technology and innovation to actually change the way that we manage our business. So we're looking at all kinds of technologies that actually, don't use heat and energy in the same way that the pioneering technologies did, and a lot of these are getting at the extraction part of our business and using solvents and electromagnetic waves and lots of whizzy stuff to try and really change the energy balance of the business big time. But we're also looking further downstream in processing at how you actually change the energy mix as you keep moving through the value chain of your business. And frankly, we're also investing in low carbon businesses like renewable energy. We believe the world is going to decarbonize over time. We will use hydrocarbon fossil fuel-based energy for a long, long time, given the demand profile Hal mentioned. But the world needs all forms of energy, and the world it's starting to incent more and more behavior into these alternate renewable energy forms. So again, Suncor, part of our strategy is to actually be in that part of the value chain as well. So it's a very I'd say a very optimist. We don't view climate change as a giant threat to us. We actually view it as an opportunity of how to try and compete within our industry in a way that is most sensible, drive costs out of our business, sustain ourselves for the long haul, and position ourselves to be the leading energy company of tomorrow. And we're trying to view it as a real opportunity, not a threat. And I think the other big trend that you maybe didn't mention that I think is making this so pressing in terms of the polarization of this debate is social media, frankly, and the kind of change in communications practices around the world over the last 5 or 10 years. It's just made the kind of intersections of social, environmental, and economic interests completely collide in ways they've never collided before. And I find, you described my role in our company, I find over half my time is actually spent in all these external engagements almost, whereas 10 or 15 years ago my role would have been very internally focused. So just the way we do our business is changing through technology, through the way we operate, through the businesses we're in, and through the way we engage with stakeholders.
Great, well thank you. Maybe it would, one of the things we want to do at the outset is really talk about this landscape. So let's pull it back up to that landscape level. And Mark, maybe I'll go to you. I mean, you've been a part of the Canadian energy and environment debates for a long time, both in industry and government. Emphasis on the government side. 5 years as Prime Minister Harper's Director of Policy and Research. So you've been on the front lines of some of this stuff. Given Canada's commitments in Paris, and given our GHG footprint in Alberta, as ministers, environment ministers in the government start to, get ready for the next round of national negotiations, is the rest of Canada, getting ready for another round of blame Alberta?
A lot has changed in the last year. A year ago, we really had Quebec and British Columbia having carbon pricing systems, which they had been in place for a number of years, but nothing really happening at the national level, and not a lot of indication that anything was going to happen at the national level. Then, with the election in Alberta, the decision in Ontario to join cap and trade, and the federal election, all of a sudden, the landscape has completely changed. So we now have the 4 largest provinces with 75-80% of the economic activity, 75-80% of the emissions, having committed to bring in some form of substantial carbon pricing by 2018. Of course, Alberta already had carbon pricing with ESCR, but this is a much more comprehensive system. And now you have a federal government that says we want to have some form of a national climate strategy. I mean, we had ambitious climate targets for both Copenhagen and Paris under the previous government, but there wasn't really a very concrete plan to achieve those targets. You now have a government that says we want to have a plan to achieve those targets, and that carbon pricing we would see as being part of the solution. So now essentially we have to figure out how we knit together these 3 quite different systems that they have in BC, Ontario, and Quebec, and Alberta, and bring the other 6 provinces on board, and do it while meeting Canada's international obligations, which I think is it's a huge challenge. I think sort of the premiers meeting pre-Paris there was a great photo op and a lot of self-congratulation. Now the really hard work will begin, and I think we'll see that. The environment ministers are meeting this week in Ottawa, and then in early March, the premiers will meet, and I think that will be the launch of, probably a year-long process to try to arrive at some kind of a national consensus on what carbon pricing might look like. And I think in that respect, Alberta, I think, was very smart getting ahead of the curve. Rather than being a policy taker, Alberta can be a policy maker by putting a really substantial proposal on the table. When we get into the details, I'd argue that they have the best design system of the three, at least in terms of the way they would go about imposing and collecting the carbon price. I would dispute the way the government intends to spend the revenues, but I think the design of the policy is very sound, and that's a tribute to Andrew and the panel.
Just one quick follow-up. So if you're going to try to hold the line at 2 degrees Celsius, I mean, how serious do you think the federal government is about that commitment? I mean, and is it possible, really?
Well, I mean, the 2 degrees Celsius commitment is, or the even more ambitious, the 1.5 degrees Celsius commitment is not something that the government of Canada could hope to achieve on its own. All Canada could do is say, this would be our part to achieve those targets at a global level. And I think you have to look at what is realistic and achievable. I think the goals that the previous government set, which was 17% reductions by 2020, 30% reductions by 2030, those are actually hugely ambitious targets for Canada to achieve, given the profile of the hydrocarbon sector, the cold climate that Hal talked about. So I would much rather focus, rather than focus on whether this target is sufficient to reach 2 degrees or whether this target is ambitious enough. I'd much rather focus on what is a plan that could actually get us to a 30% reduction by 2030.
Right. Okay. So Andrew, it's only fair, since the next section I'm going to ask you to sort of lay out what you're trying to do in the climate strategy and have everybody kind of comment on it, that you get to comment on what you've heard so far, and I'll just open the floor to you.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I think those who've gone before me here have really laid the landscape out very well in terms of what the challenges that we were looking at as a panel coming in was, first of all, thinking of that global energy system, and not just what type of transition is going to be required of the global energy system to meet some of the goals that you're talking about, but what are the positions that Alberta is going to want to advocate globally in order to make that happen, and how are we positioned relative to some of the people to whom we're going to be advocating. And so we've already heard about coal-fired power. And if you look across jurisdictions in the world, any of the energy modeling you see globally, to meet 2 degrees C, coal is the thing you have to get out of as quickly as you can. And otherwise, you're leaving yourself with a very non-cost-effective, very expensive policy. Is everyone else getting that echo? Okay. And if you look at Alberta, in terms of jurisdictions in the world, we're best positioned. We have access to an incredible resource of low-cost gas, but also very strong renewables resources, et cetera. So, I've been in Alberta now for 10 years, and I think every single presentation that I've seen on climate change in Alberta has, in some way or another, included the words, the world has to get off coal. And if we are a wealthy jurisdiction, best positioned in the world to do it in terms of substitutes, and we're going to be going out in the world and advocating for action on climate change, but saying we can't do it here, that's a challenging position to advocate. Second of all, we've heard a lot about targets versus policies, and I think that was key for us as well, was to say, how do we change this conversation from one where people are going to have a giant pie dividing contest, people are going to talk about various rules by which we're going to determine who gets what quantity and how do we divide this global carbon budget or whatever you want to call it, to talking about what actually matters, talking about targets, or talking about policies, excuse me. And I had a conversation that I think is emblematic of this during our climate panel work. I met with Gary Mason from the Globe and Mail, and it was right after our launch, and Gary pins me down and he says, you can't imagine going into this process without a target in mind. How can you start this process without a target? I said, well, who do you think is the leading jurisdiction from climate policy perspective in Canada? And he said, well, BC, obviously. And I said, what's their target? He didn't know. I said, what's their policy? He said, $30 a ton tax on every ton of carbon. Why is BC a leader? Because they have a policy, and their targets that they put forward have always been what they expect their policies to accomplish. And that was crucial for us, was to go in and say, what policies do we think we can impose that we can stand up to nationally and globally, and then report to Albertans on what we expect those policies to accomplish. And people did come to us afterwards and say, but what's your target? And to which my response was, would you ask that question of a finance minister? If a finance minister came out with a budget and said, these are all our tax policies, this is our revenue projection, but these are our targets, the first question you'd ask is, how do you intend to get there? And what we tried to deliver on was, how do you intend to get there? The last piece, I think, of the puzzle, and for those of you that have seen our climate panel report, if you haven't read it, I'm not answering your questions today. But if you read Gord Lambert's little 200-word bit at the beginning, and many of you will have worked with Eric's former colleague Gord in the past, and Gord talks about a policy which allows us to go from defense to offense. And I think that's crucial. If you think of how Alberta's been positioned to the world on this climate policy debate, it's been, we have a vibrant industry here. We have a world-class opportunity, which if anybody sneezes the word climate change might all go away and go poof. So come bring your money here and invest here for the long term. That's not the message we want to send. We want to send the message that we have an industry that is viable under globally credible carbon policies and is a reasonable place to put your money. And we want to give both the government and the industry the tools to say, for example, if you look across carbon policies applied globally, now find me one in which you face the same incentives that you do in Alberta to reduce emissions. And furthermore, start to use that as a lever. So we've seen a lot of debate last week, East versus West. Well, if you look at the carbon pricing that's applied or proposed to be applied in Alberta, it's at least double the price of what's going to be applied to similar activities in Quebec. So if we're looking at who's taking this problem seriously, I think we now have a much stronger lever. So tell me again why your industry is not viable under the carbon policy that's applied to the oil sands. That's a very strong use of what used to be a negative reputation. And so I think what we've hopefully put forward is something which allows, as Gord says, Alberta to go from defense to offense on this issue to protect Alberta's interest, while also at the same time, instead of advocating away from effective policies, to advocate towards effective policies and to do stuff here which is consistent with the global energy transition that we want to see, while also keeping in mind the realities that Hal laid out for us.
That's great. So defense to offense, but what if that offense doesn't get us market access? What do we do? Open that to all of you. If the office doesn't get us our market access, is it worth it or not?
So I was reading yesterday, just doing a little bit of a scan, and it was September 2011 that we saw Prime Minister Harper talk about Keystone XL as a no-brainer. It was somewhere around that time that we saw a letter from Joe Oliver to the environmental groups that may or may not have angered a few people in the country. And then we saw 5 more years of, well, 3 U.S. congressional election cycles that, well, if we get through the next election, we'll get the pipeline. If we just, are a little more aggressive, tell our story a little bit better, run a different ad campaign. It's been it's been basically 2 months with a Christmas holiday in the middle since the strategy changed. And so I think the first thing is you got to give it some time, right? You can't say this was never going to be something which changed the world overnight to people understanding why we need market access. The second thing it was never going to do was it was never going to change people's perceived spill risk. And people's perceived spill risk has been amped up by people fighting the oil sands. Those thoughts are still there. And to say to somebody, effectively, you shouldn't be worried about the spill you've been hearing about forever because Alberta's got a carbon policy, that's not going to move the dial. So then the onus shifts, and Hal can speak to this better than anybody, the onus now shifts back to the pipeline companies and to the National Energy Board to have the conversation they're actually designed to have. One is assurance to the local population that this infrastructure is safe. 2 is the National Energy Board's role, which is ensuring that infrastructures in the national interest actually gets built over and above sort of provincial, local concerns, and more importantly, provincial revenue seeking. So I think you're now back to the conversation we should have, but by no means do you have a magic bullet.
Anyone want to jump in?
Just building a touch on that, I think that's exactly right, and that it really reestablishes the credibility of what we call an adult conversation around pipelines again. So, you know, our climate policy in Alberta and generally in Canada is as good as anywhere else in the world now, and it completely changes the tone of the dialogue in any of the kind of shrill conversations that have been going on around pipelines and around the oil sands. I think you already saw instant impact of that at Paris, where the narrative about Canada was completely different at Paris than it was in prior COP rounds. And, you know, the policy was announced, I think, 5 days before the Paris round started, but it's enabling different conversations with all stakeholders that, you know, time will tell if it actually leads to market access. I will point out that, you know, Alberta set another export record to the U.S. last year in crude oil sales and things like. Products find a way to get to markets, and you know, hopefully good government policy will allow them to find ways to markets in the most efficient, effective way, which is pipelines. So I think it's allowing a rational conversation to take place again that wasn't before some of these policies came in. So we view it as quite helpful to the market access debate. But it in of itself won't solve it. It'll just enable the players to work together again more collaboratively on it.
Sure.
I think a point that Andrew made that I'd like to underscore is the role of the National Energy Board in assessing these things thoroughly and according to a defined set of terms of reference, if you will, and determining whether or not the project is in the national interest. We have this very difficult situation in Canada today where different provinces and even municipalities are objecting to projects on the basis that there's no particular benefit for them in the project. And of course, this is very disruptive to the national character of our country, I think. But I'd just like to mention the enormous impact that it has on Alberta when we do not have adequate pipeline capacity. If the tariff to move a barrel of oil from here to Chicago is $5, then the netback in Alberta for a comparable oil would be $5 less in Alberta than it would be if we could go back to those glorious days when oil was $85 a barrel. You'd get $85 for it in Chicago, you'd get $80 for it in Alberta due to that $5 tariff. But when the pipeline system is running at 99% full or 101% full, we have the differential, the market differential that blows out. And suddenly Alberta oil is selling for $15 or $20 a barrel less, not the $5 that the tariff would indicate, because the marginal barrel is moving by rail or truck or some other way. And the impact is not just on the producers. In fact, many of the big producers hold firm service on the pipe, so they escape the problem. But it's 80% of the producers in Alberta that do not have the financial capability to sign long-term contracts that get hit very hard. And one of the biggest losers, interestingly, is the government of Alberta Treasury, because royalties are calculated on different kind of reference prices that do reflect that differential. So it becomes a multi-billion-dollar problem. It's not just about Enbridge or TransCanada failing to secure a profitable project. The impact of the Keystone failure is much more significant on the producing sector and on the government of Alberta than it is on my friends at TransCanada. So these are very big picture issues that have a multi-billion-dollar impact on the national economy. And for that reason, the NEB's role in weighing in on making the decision and the recommendation to Cabinet, we've got to somehow reestablish the credibility of that process.
If I could, I mean, it's not my job in my current role to worry about how Alberta gets its oil to market, but I think that having a credible climate policy gives, for both Alberta and Canada, gives Alberta an argument, an arrow in its quiver that it wouldn't otherwise have. And I think if you see Kathleen Wynne's reaction this week when Premier Notley was there, you know, this is quite a different narrative coming from Ontario than we've seen in the past regarding pipelines from Alberta. Hillary Clinton stayed on the fence for an awful long time on Keystone. And when I was still in the PMO, she approved the Clipper pipeline in record time. So she doesn't have any difficulty with pipelines, but I think she was looking for something she could say to her electorate that she clearly felt she didn't have. And there are other, the European Union with the European Fuels Directive, there are a lot of moderate, pragmatic politicians that have got green parties and green electorates they have to worry about. They need counter arguments. So I think this gives Alberta an argument in the global stage.
Okay, Andrew, one quick comment, and then let's move into a bit more of a detailed dive into the plan. So maybe you can roll your comments into the explanation of what you're trying to accomplish with the plan.
Sure, I can do that. So I just wanted to flip the conversation we were having there a little bit to remind people we often focus on the risks to Alberta of global coordinated greenhouse gas policy, which is probably never going to happen. And I think what we need to emphasize, and Keystone and others provide a great example of that, European FQD is another one, of the risks to fragmented, targeted, discriminatory policies. And if you ask to Hal's point of what are the costs of some of those policies when the target is firmly on Alberta, they can be much, much higher than the policies that were imposed in a coordinated way across all jurisdictions in the world. So that was one of the issues that we went into. But let me tell you just a little bit about how we got to where we're going, what our mandate was, and where we went. The Premier gave us what, from my point of view, was an incredibly open mandate. And it was essentially 4 dimensions: improve Alberta's carbon pricing regime, weigh in on accelerated phase out of coal, weigh in on acceleration of power from renewables, and talk about improving energy efficiency both industrially, commercially, and residentially. And so the way we came at that, and a couple of points we've heard already, was in a couple of ways. First of all, on carbon pricing, we all know the critique of economists, right? Economists have 2 hands, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. Carbon pricing is one of these things where economists essentially only have one hand, where if you put 100 economists in the room, and there's a few of you in the room, 95 to 99 of them will likely say the most cost-effective way to handle an emissions problem is through pricing it, because it puts the decisions in the hands of the entrepreneurs. It isn't the government telling you what kind of insulation to install or what kind of car to drive or what have you, or when to drive it. It allows the individuals to make those decisions. So our first mandate, really, we looked at and said, to us, that's obvious. That's the way to go. But carbon pricing doesn't solve all problems. And the problem that economists often have, myself included in the past, is to forget the next lecture that we learn about after we learn about the efficiency of carbon pricing, which is we learn about something called the theory of the second best, which is that when you put in what would otherwise be the best policy in an environment where there are other imperfections or other imperfect policies, bad things can happen. And so you may need other complementary policies to ensure those bad outcomes. So let's just to give you a sense, how many of you in here would say that you assign a value greater than 0 to reliability in the electricity system? If I did a little survey. Wow, that's actually, so we're only at about 10%. 90% of you are sleeping and not listening to me and probably haven't read the report. Wake up, put your hands up. So all of you would probably say I have some value greater than 0 to reliability in the electricity system. But Alberta's electricity market actually places 0 value on that. So if you say, I'm going to solve the carbon problem with just a carbon price, and I'm going to let the market figure it out, you're taking the risk that a lot of players in the electricity industry would suddenly say, okay, I've figured it out. It's no longer optimal for you to operate this plant. I'm going to exit right away. And now you've created a reliability problem on the back of your supposed optimal policy on carbon pricing. So that was a piece we were looking at as well, was not just a pure carbon pricing system, but where are the areas where there are roles for complementary policies. And what we came down on was, on the carbon pricing front, make it broader, make it better. And make it broader to the point that Hal made earlier. We tend to look and say, you talk to anyone in the oil and gas industry, or really any economist, what do you want from a carbon pricing system? You want it broad so you get access to the most emissions reductions. If you talk to the oil and gas industry, all the submissions to our panel, electricity industry, all the submissions to our panel, it matters at the consumer side too. But yet, for Alberta's policies in the past, we were essentially operating with one hand tied behind our back. We only had policies that imposed constraints on the industrial sector. We did not have anything which imposed that similar trade-off on consumers. So you want to meet the same target, to Mark's point, you're going to need a much higher price if your policy only focuses on the industrial sector than if you focus it more broadly. So we looked at that. Second thing we wanted to do was make it better. Under the previous carbon pricing regime, if two individuals built an oil sands project, two companies built an oil sands project, one with twice the emissions intensity of the other, the response of the previous policy would have been to provide more free credits to the more emissions intensive project. So think of the government, right? Don't get lost in the idea of a carbon credit. Just think of the government writing a check. As part of our climate policy, because you've built a more emissions intensive production facility, we will give you a larger check every single year for 20 years. We're capitalizing high emissions intensity as part of a policy to lower emissions. That's backwards. So what we said was flip that. Say that everybody will be judged on the same baseline. So if you build the best oil sands facility that we have ever seen built in the province, not only will you earn revenue from the sale of bitumen, but you will potentially earn revenue from the sale of emissions credits because you're judged against an industry-wide performance standard. If you build a facility that has emissions intensity 5 times the emissions of a conventional barrel, you're actually going to pay more. And so tilt the playing field to drive capital and investment towards innovation and better rocks. So that was on the carbon pricing side. We also put in place programs for methane emissions reduction that try to, again, use the power of the market instead of a heavy-handed regulatory approach, which would say, we're going to force you to replace these products today, and that's going to be a multi-million-dollar cost across operators, large and small in the province, multi-hundred-million-dollar cost. We're going to actually turn it into a business opportunity. So if you replace, and this is where the carbon pricing lever works really well, if you replace your high bleed pneumatic devices in year 1, you will get 7 years worth of offset credit, which could turn that investment into something that would earn a 15 to 20% rate of return on capital. If you wait till year 2, you'll get 6 years of offset. Make it a 15 to 20% rate, a little lower rate of return. Wait till year 3, well, you get 5 years of offset credit, and so on, until year 7. You've waited that long, now the regulation's going to come in and get you to do it. So now what you have is an incentive for operators to report on the equipment they have, to come forward to the government of their own volition without a regulatory hammer, replace it as soon as possible to make it a money-making investment. So you get you target the methane in that way. Next thing, electricity sector. We had really 2 objectives. One was don't do what Ontario did. And 2 was use Alberta's situation to its advantage, particularly as it relates to natural gas. And many of you will have seen a report that was out this week predicting really high electricity prices in Alberta as a result of the panel recommendations. I have no problem with their modeling. The problem is they didn't model what we proposed. They actually removed all of the controls that we put in to see, well, what if the government did something that was more expensive instead? But we actually put a lot of controls in to make sure that electricity prices would not go up significantly. Under our policy, natural gas is cheaper than it would otherwise be. Why? It's the cleanest source of power. So again, back to the oil sands side of the world, cleanest source of fossil fuel power. So if you look under the previous regime, you built the best natural gas plant that's ever been built in Alberta, policy would have said, great, reduce it by 20% or pay us money. Under our policy, it says, great, thanks. But if you build a higher emissions plant, you're going to have a carbon liability associated with it. So under our policy, natural gas power is $2 to $3 a megawatt hour cheaper than it would have otherwise been. Second piece of the puzzle is renewables. And what we said there was Albertans, by and large, even in our public engagement where you had people who said, absolutely, positively, never act on this, this is the worst thing you could possibly do, but maybe do some renewables, right? This was renewables and home insulation were the 2 things that universally had strong support. So we said, great, but it's not worth doing at any price. So what we want you to see the government do is, unlike Ontario, which said we'll pay as much as we have to get as many renewables as we can into the system, and then we'll compensate existing players for the hole that creates in the market, what we said was put some support on the table, comparable to what U.S. markets put on the table, but cap it, don't do it at any price, and make it competitive. So have firms bid for the level of support they need, so use the incentives of the market to push that cost down as far as we can, but force all of those players to maintain exposure to Alberta's electricity market. So if the investment is not viable with revenue sources from Alberta's electricity market, if the price is 0 when your wind is blowing, you won't be able to build that wind plant and it won't happen. So put the challenge to the renewables industry: make this work. You've been telling us for years that it's grid parity. Hal cited some of these studies that said it's cost competitive. Prove it. And that's what we wanted to do with that. And there's a lot of other pieces of the puzzle, but I see Trevor getting out of his seat here. So that's the end of my stump speech.
That was great. I want to create some rich disagreement now. So did Andrew get it right? He makes a compelling case, but did the panel get it right? Mark, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a number of things that the panel did get right. I think, for one thing, the process itself, the panel that was appointed, it really was a very independent, credible panel. There was broad public consultation. You know, and there's not a sense that this was a report written in the Premier's office. It really was the panel's report. So I think for that, the government is to be congratulated, and the panel is to be congratulated. It is a simple, transparent approach to carbon pricing. I think the way they've dealt with competitiveness with the performance-based standard is innovative, and I think a smarter approach than you know, the sort of 100% free allocations of credits that they're giving to industry in Ontario and Quebec, and it deals with the competitiveness challenges that BC didn't really deal with in its system. But as Andrew says, it gives an incentive for innovation and continuous improvement. So I thought that was good. Two areas I would disagree. I think that the panel should have tried to use pricing more to drive change in electricity than you know, explicit targets on renewables and support for renewables and coal phase out. I think if you had a price that started at 30 and industry could see in a predictable way was going to increase over time, then coal to gas switching, increase in renewables, perhaps looking at, you know, small-scale nuclear in northern Alberta, these things would happen as market-based decisions. And there's an argument around reliability, which I think Andrew makes, but I think to have the market, you know, price the externalities of the damage that carbon is assumed to have in the future, make sure those are fully priced, and then let market players make the decision as to how electricity is produced in Alberta, or how electricity is produced in BC and imported into Alberta, which I think is another option that should be looked at. The big area where I have concerns is that, you know, this is a $3 billion increase to the overall size of government. And while there was a recommendation in the report to compensate average households through a consumer rebate, which we would support, that really only accounts for about 25% of the revenues. The rest of those revenues are, you know, kind of unallocated. There's talk about technology, talk about infrastructure, talk about, you know, other programs. We would rather have that money returned entirely to the Alberta economy in corporate tax cuts, personal tax cuts, and really make sure that the system is revenue neutral, because that's the way that pricing can influence behavior. If the price increases over time, but the consumer and businesses have confidence that the size of government is not going to grow, their overall tax bill is not going to grow, then I think that allows people to adjust to a rising carbon price and you know, seeing that changing behavior.
Do you think that it threatens the ability to actually implement this over time if you don't make it revenue neutral?
I think it could. I mean, it makes it easier to reverse the policy. In British Columbia, when there was, you know, one thing that's I think is very positive about British Columbia is the debate has been depolarized. Eric talked about the polarization of this debate, but it was brought in by a center-right government and really disarmed the left-wing voices and the NGO voices. You know, a lot of the NGOs supported what Gordon Campbell tried to do. When Christy Clark came in with a new team, there was a lot of skepticism about the carbon price, and I know there was a lot of thought given to, do we repeal it? And then they realized, if we repeal it, we have a $1.5 billion hole in our budget. We're going to have to increase taxes. Mm-hmm. So they left it in place, and they've now come to, you know, re-embrace the carbon tax in British Columbia. If carbon price was fully refunded, Alberta could lower its corporate and personal taxes to, you know, what they were before the last election, to the lowest levels in Canada. And it would be very hard for a future government to unravel that package. If a government wanted to repeal the carbon tax, they know they'd have to increase other taxes. So I think it makes it politically a much more stable and viable program.
Anyone else? Eric?
Yeah, maybe I would just emphasize, obviously, that revenue recycling point. Certainly our advocacy was that the revenues should be fully recycled back into tax reductions or something, and that wasn't where the government went. So, you know, that was certainly an area that we wouldn't have fully aligned with. And but the other interesting part of this policy that you've heard some controversy about is the oil sands limit on, or cap on emissions. And I wanted to just talk for a minute about that because, you know, I'll share with you how Suncor thinks about that. Anyway, that's been a controversial measure for some wondering, oh, gee, are you actually going to, you know, not allow the industry to grow? We actually view that as a signal that growth is going to occur in the industry, which is actually a helpful signal, again, in the polarized debate out there. So the current emissions in the industry today are somewhere in the order of 65 million tons a year. And the limit was set at 100 million tons with two allowances above that, a 10 million ton allowance for future upgrading investment, which is really, again, a government decision that they want to incent value-added activity and the creation of jobs. So that creates an additional 10 million tons on top of the 100, and then cogen that is developed in the oil sands, which is actually a very helpful way to help backfill the move off of coal. It's the oil sands happen to be one of the kind of natural places for some of the most efficient electricity generation to occur because of the combined steam and power needs of the industry, and so they also allowed cogen to develop without affecting the limit. And so we actually view that as expanding the limit even beyond the 100 million tons, certainly. But if you look at the limit, it signals to the world that growth will occur in the oil sands. It also signals to all the players that technology and innovation must continue to make the industry more efficient, effective, and actually continue to operate within the limit. So all the debate really was about what level should the limit be set at. But the concept of a limit we actually viewed as quite a positive, favorable thing to drive those signals into the policy. And as I say, whether we got the limit fully right in the final policy, we'll, I guess, wait to be seen how quickly or how long it takes to boost up to that limit. But current estimates from CAP and others would really show that it's going to be 2030 or so before that limit even really starts to come into effect. And as I talked about our own optimism about technology development and other things, I think we'd like to push that out even farther before that becomes any kind of constraint.
Okay, so global carbon budget, decarbonization, and whether the NEB should look at emissions. Who wants to go? Andrew.
Yeah. So I think those two questions are actually more related than they might sound, right? Global decarbonization and National Energy Board. And I've always thought that the National Energy Board should have climate policy as its core mandate, but not in the way that it's been pushed. I see it as core to the needs assessment mandate of the NEB, which is to say, is this project viable in a world that acts on climate change and in a country that meets its commitments on climate change? And if you look at how we've assessed pipelines before, we have national commitments on climate change, provincial policies on climate change, and potential global actions on climate change, while we're assessing policies under forecasts, or we're assessing pipelines and infrastructure under forecasts where none of those actions take place. And we wouldn't allow that. For example, we would never allow the NEB to evaluate a pipeline under a $200 oil forecast today. So let's not evaluate it under a zero action on climate change, either domestically or internationally.
Hal?
One of the complicated issues is that the NEB is typically evaluating the pipeline from point A to point B and what are the emissions of that project, and it becomes a whole lot more comprehensive and difficult if you start looking at all the sources of oil production that feed into that pipeline. And while they haven't done this to date, it could become really complicated if they also looked at all the consumers at the other end of the pipeline and what are they going to do in terms of emissions once they have access to the incremental volumes of oil or gas that are flowing through. So a comprehensive look at the whole thing becomes a very complicated undertaking for any regulator or any government to look at. But I think there is some room here, because we have a major problem in Canada and in the United States as well, that when a pipeline proponent brings a project forward, they're expected to file a complete package with the regulator, right down to the foundation bolt design for the compressors is the example I like to use, and put that all in. In the case of the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, ExxonMobil, TransCanada, and the other partners, we spent something approaching $800 million on doing all of that very detailed work and surveying all of the creek crossings and studying all of the little challenges of building that pipeline. But that wasn't actually the question. The real question was, does Canada want a Mackenzie Valley pipeline, and how does it dovetail with Aboriginal policy, and how should all of this go ahead? Similarly, in the case of Energy East, there actually is a very, very low environmental risk from this kind of a project. If you look at the millions of barrels of crude oil moved every day over thousands of kilometers, it's hard to imagine a human system that operates more safely and more efficiently than these large long-haul pipelines. They're quite different than short-haul production lines in an oil field. These big systems that run across the continent are extremely safe and efficient. So that's not really the issue. The issue is something bigger. I'm not exactly sure what the issue for the mayors of Montreal is, but there's got to be something there. And so we need to dig into those kind of things and answer the question earlier on before we get into the detailed technical review. Is this project in the national interest? Does Canada want to do it? Let's think about the impact on greenhouse gas, and let's think about what the product will be used for at the other end. Let's examine all of those things, but do it at a high level. Don't do it in a grinding, painful, detailed process that takes 7 years. We've been going about it the wrong way, in my view.
Well, two things. On the question about decarbonization by 2050, I mean, if Canada's share of 1,000 gigatons was roughly 20 gigatons, we have 700 megatons of emissions per year. That would mean in 30 years, Canada would have to have zero emissions. So we basically have 30 years of emissions left, and then we have to have absolute zero, which is probably not a realistic goal if it's to be achieved entirely through reducing emissions, but there's also the potential of negative emissions through increasing forest sinks in places like Brazil and China, and also through things like carbon engineering, actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So that may not be viable today, but over 30 to 50 years, maybe you can have a lot more negative emissions counteracting fossil fuel emissions. I think it is appropriate for the regulator. I mean, as Hal says, the NEB process on any of these major projects is a hugely comprehensive project, down to the micro level. So I think it would also be appropriate for the regulator to look up to the macro level and say, how does this large project, a major LNG plant in BC or a major pipeline, affect Canada's overall emissions and global overall emissions? I mean, the State Department did that for Keystone, and their initial report was actually pretty reasonable until the government decided it wanted a more political report. Mm-hmm. But I think for the regulator to have a look at what the global impact of emissions is as part of its regulatory process would actually increase confidence in the regulatory decision. If people said, okay, well, this pipeline will have a net impact of 0.5% of Canada's overall emissions, or this LNG plant will increase emissions in Canada but might lower emissions in China, that might actually be a positive thing, would increase confidence in regulatory decisions.
I was mostly surprised to see a Quebec politician arguing that the federal body should assume jurisdiction over something that had traditionally been largely provincial jurisdiction. But any questions? Any other questions for the second round? Dylan Jones at the back, Mark Kissling at the front.
Sure, a comment and a question. On the issue of whether this helps us get pipelines built, I think Andrew was absolutely right that it deals with one of the major outstanding questions. He mentioned another one, which was spill perceived spill risk. I think she's absolutely right that we're not paying enough attention. So we're all thinking, oh, you know, BC and Montreal are being greedy. They have an issue around spills, right, that we need to deal with. I just want to add a piece, which isn't spill risk, it's spill response. So there's been an outstanding concern. Both BC and Quebec have raised the issue of a $10 billion cleanup, right? And this notion that they're holding the bag on a massive risk profile. We need to deal with that issue. Right? It's a very, very significant issue. Anyway, my question is about leakage. So we've been comparing ourselves to other provinces. What we haven't been doing is comparing our policy regime to the other people that produce oil and gas. And the United States, of course, has quietly grown its oil production by 4 million barrels per day while opposing KXL over the last 5 years. I want to ask a technical question, though, right, which is, how do we fare in a world where our oil and gas production competitors, many of whom who are being treated very nicely by the environmental movement, for the most part have absolutely no carbon policy related to production?
Thank you. And Doug, if you could come up here. Greg has a question up at the front here.
Thank you, Greg Kiesling, Bullfrog Power. My question is, the premiers are all going to come together in March and try to come together with some sort of federal policy. What would the panel's recommendation be to the Premier of Alberta on what she should try to achieve with the other provinces?
I think we have one more at the front here.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Julia Freyer. I'm with London Economics. And I wanted to ask a couple of questions to bring it back down to Alberta and understanding the consequences of the proposed government policies in the 2030 timeframe for Alberta. And specifically, I heard Professor Leach today, you talking about the importance of the controls for the RPS, the renewable standard, the effective cap on subsidies. And then we have also government targeting 30% penetration of renewables as well by 2030. Which one of those is expected as a constraint to survive? Because I could see them being in conflict with each other. If it takes more money to subsidize, so do we give up on the 30% goal? Or maybe another way to ask it is, under what conditions can those two requirements coexist peacefully and succeed?
Okay, who wants to kick it off?
I'll maybe start us off here. And I'll maybe just tackle a little bit of Dylan's question here around pipelines and leakage and bring a new concept into the conversation we haven't talked about much today. So firstly, we have talked lots about climate and that impact on pipelines. I won't go there again. I think there is a huge effort around spill risk and spill response that needs to occur, and I think industry and federal organizations and others are going to have to put their minds around that to make real progress, and I think there's a concerted effort underway that hopefully will lead to world-class practices there, where again Canada can just be a leader. Now even if we got those two aspects right, I still wonder if we would get pipelines built, and it's for a third reason that actually we find at the heart of many of these conversations. This may go to what is really on some people's minds beyond just the technical arguments they're making in opposition, and that's the whole Aboriginal involvement and engagement in these infrastructure developments, which in Canada's case inevitably involve complex Aboriginal partnerships, and I think for us to be successful we actually have to develop a complete new way to actually partner and engage Aboriginal communities in these developments as well that we really haven't developed yet in the country. So it's it may still not be enough just to have good spill response and climate policy. We actually are going to need different business models, and You know, Suncor is involved in every one of these market developments, as you can imagine, that we're talking about, and virtually every one of them is going to require some form of innovation in Aboriginal space. So I think that's going to be a growing competency of all of our companies, of all of our stakeholders, and we better find different ways to actually make progress on the Aboriginal front. Just quickly on leakage, you know, it's a difficult question about how do you hold the whole world accountable to the same standards and disciplines. I would say that something like Paris is a good first start to actually get fairly unified commitment to, you know, put in policies to try and limit emissions. And it's probably the biggest consensus and kind of collaborative tone coming out of any of these sessions, and I think we're going to have to hold others accountable, but competitiveness needs to be built into every one of these policies, and I think Andrew and his panel did a good job trying to look at that in terms of performance standards and other things. But you know, to have a decarbonization by 2050 or by 2100 goal or outcome and then find Canada's the only place on earth actually decarbonizing would not be a good happy outcome for anybody. So you know, it's going to be a bit of a how do you hold the entire world together on this, and that's going to require real leadership among our governments at provincial and national levels, frankly, and climate's going to be a growing competency they're going to need too.
Just a couple of quick comments. First of all, on the risk of major pipeline failure and the impact of that and the costs of dealing with it. I think we have to look at the risk and the reward of all of these different undertakings. And when you look at the major long-haul pipeline systems in North America, not the short little production lines or some of the small regional pipelines, but the big systems, the Enbridges, TransCanadas, Kinder Morgans, the probability of significant occurrence is very low, and industry has proven its ability to clean up 95% of those kinds of incidents to 100% standard. There will always be the one horrific incident that gets a lot of attention, but the reality is that the pipeline industry has an incidence of bad outcomes that's significantly less than, for example, the airline industry. If you look at the number of barrels that are transported over long distances and what percentage of them result in a bad outcome, it's a tiny, tiny number. And we have much bigger risk from the transportation of hazardous products by truck on the highway. Drive from here to Golden, as I do frequently, and the amount of big truck traffic on that road and the scary situation that you run into every time you do it would be a good example of that. And the rail movement of crude oil and other hazardous products is well accepted by society, but is in fact orders of magnitude more risky than transportation by pipeline. So I think to some extent we got to keep this all in context and recognize that all of this heightened anxiety has been created by activists who actually have another agenda in mind. It's not so much about pipeline safety, but it's what can you do to curtail the activities of the hydrocarbon value chain. So there's my redneck farmer view of all of that. The other comment I'd make is we are always setting out, and if it was advice to the Alberta government or governments in Canada generally, I would say be very careful about making global leading, very aggressive targets, setting things that are going to be very difficult to achieve. If anyone in the room would like to take a bet with me as to whether we will be decarbonized by the year 2050, I'd be happy to take that bet. And I would take it because I've read a lot from very sober, clear-thinking people like the recent ExxonMobil report that predicts a very significant decrease in the carbon intensity of human activity, but certainly not a decarbonization of the global economy by the year 2050. So 2050 seems like a long ways out, but we need to be careful about setting 5- and 10-year targets when what we're talking about is a change out of major capital equipment that will take decades to occur.
Tom, are you going to act as the bookie here? Or, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'll take it.
No. Okay, Mark?
Well, on the leakage question, I mean, I do think that the panel report had a pretty creative approach to dealing with leakage with the performance-based standards for the export-intensive industries. But our view is that this really is an appropriate role for the federal government, and that rather than having different regimes across the country dealing with competitiveness in different ways, we should really have a national carbon price. I mean, the revenues we think should remain at the provincial level, but we should have a national carbon price that applies to all emissions, and the federal government should really be the ones dealing with competitiveness at the border through some form of border carbon adjustment. That's an issue that we're actively exploring right now. But I think in the interim, with the different provincial systems, I think the way that this panel report has gone about it is quite positive. As for what the premiers should say and what Premier Notley should say, I think all the premiers are going to say, well, I gave it the office, so you don't have to do anything in our province. I think Alberta now has a more credible case to make for that, but I think what I would advocate for is that there should be a national price, and that all consumption-based emissions of fossil fuels should be priced at roughly $30 a ton, like Alberta and BC are planning to do by 2018. And I think if Premier Notley said, let's talk about that rather than arguing about the allocation of the pie and whose targets are bigger than whose.
Can you stitch those together, like different systems together nicely, or do you need uniform systems?
I think it would be complicated to do it. I mean, I think you had an interesting suggestion in terms of a national offset system, but you need to figure out, the competitiveness is something that you could deal with at the national level. Like, you need to figure out which pieces you can do at the national level, and which pieces are best dealt with at the provincial level. And I think that'll take a few years to knit the systems together, but I think it will happen. As for the last question about the renewable portfolio standard and whether the policy or the target is what should dictate the outcome, I would say the policy. And if the policy doesn't succeed, if the incentives put on the table, I mean, we wouldn't really want to see incentives put on the table anyway. But if the incentives put on the table aren't sufficient to drive new renewables, then look again at the policy. Don't commit to reaching a 30% artificial goal at all costs. And I would say that one source of renewable electricity that Alberta has access to is Site C Power in BC, which they're going to build to export to California. Why not look at bringing that here?
Okay, great.
So I think most of this has all been summarized. I'll pick up on the competitiveness question. So that was very crucial for us to address that competitiveness question, but it was crucial to address it in a way that aligned with the other aspects of our files. So if you look at what barrels become more versus less competitive what new barrels become more versus less competitive under our proposed regime, the ones that are most likely to have a home in the global oil market, the lower cost, lower emissions, more competitive barrels actually become lower cost under what we proposed. And so if you're looking at, and I was running some numbers last night, an in situ project with a steam oil ratio of 2, so a Christina Lake kind of barrel, you're probably 40 cents a barrel on full life cycle cost cheaper today than you would have been on May 1st. And those are the ones that we need to position to be competitive. The really high cost, really high emissions barrels probably don't have a role. And so that's where the bet on technology comes in, that the hope is that you can drive down your other barrels. On the question of, I think Mark's bang on, the federal-provincial discussion, what we hope to do is change the conversation to one about policies versus one about targets and arbitrary division of quantities. But I actually think the linking is far easier than what Mark paints out. So if you look at Ontario and Quebec's architecture and BC's architecture, Ontario and Quebec is essentially exactly what was proposed for Alberta, except their price is set by imports from California, whereas our price is set by a government schedule. If you look at BC's, their price is set by government schedule, but they don't have the emissions allocation. They do some adjustment for emissions intensity through their tax code, through fiscal policy. So the policies of those four are actually not that different when you really boil it down. They have different names on things, but they're kind of the same thing. So there's a lot of potential for linkage there. On the question of policies versus on renewables, if we wanted to say do 30% no matter what, then why would we have had a cap? Right? That was, to me, if you wanted to say the goal was 30%, then there'd be no point in having a capped policy. Now, that's panel perspective. Whether or not the government is going to say, we are committed, unlike everything else in our proposal, we're committed to this no matter what the cost, then that's obviously their prerogative. But from our perspective, it was exactly as Mark put it out, that we're prepared to provide some support. There's signals of value from Albertans, but there's not a signal to say, no matter what the cost of this, bring it into the system. And certainly the real important thing for us was don't disconnect the value proposition for new renewables from the value of the electricity, which is well signaled by the market price for electricity. So keep that link. Don't look to procurement directly of power.
I think the goal here was to understand better the environment around us, but also to understand better the climate policy. A lot of ground to cover in a short time. I think we did pretty well. So I declare success on this, but Jim Dinning laughed at me. I think these guys are sticking around for another few minutes after, so if you do have some questions you want to just ask them, please feel free to come forward and do that. A big thank you to Canadians for Clean Prosperity, Mark and Caitlin. Sorry?
I just wanted, sorry, you can complete your introductions, but I want to do a pitch for Clean Prosperity because I think unlike everyone else at this table, we're not well known in Calgary. So
okay, so big thank you to Canadians for Clean Prosperity, and they're going to do a quick pitch.
So yeah, everyone here and their respective institutions are household names in Alberta. Canadians for Clean Prosperity was started in Ontario, although over the past year we've been much more active in Alberta. Caitlin Zaki, who used to be with Environment Alberta, is our Western Canada Director. She's here. I know she invited a lot of you to this event. Monty Solberg, who many of you will know, recently joined our board. So we're in expansion mode here in the province of Alberta, and this is in some ways our first big public event that we've done here. But I'd encourage you all to take a look at our website at cleanprosperity.ca, and if you're interested, sign up for our mailing list. It's just once a week, and it's very informative and short. But love to keep in contact. And the Honourable Jim Dinning and Greg Kiesling, who we introduced before, is our board chair and founder. So.
Great. Well, and as you can see from this event, Mark and Caitlin both have real depth of knowledge in this area. So I wouldn't hesitate to reach out to them. And Bennett Jones, thank you also for the space, for doing all this, for helping to organize this. Great partners. So really appreciate it. Look forward to doing more of this in the future. Canada West Foundation.
Yes, Canada West Foundation.
Does this? This is what we do, and so we think public policy matters. It's important to get it right and make sure that it's smart public policy. So if you like what you see and you like what we do, please visit CWF.ca. We count on the support of people like yourselves to exist. So thank you.
And just lastly, under the heading of you had one job, I introduced Trevor McLeod as Trevor McDonald. Yeah. In my defense, I think McDonald rolls off the tongue much better. I'd encourage you to. I'm going to go with it.
I think we were eating McDonald's while we figured this out.
A couple other thanks. My fellow co-head of Bennett Jones Climate Change and Emissions Trading Group, Mike Barrett at the back of the room, along with my other partner, Duncan McPherson. Thank you for your help in this. And Caitlin Zaki, stand up, Caitlin. This couldn't have been done without you, so thanks for all your hard work. Thank you all for attending. These events are only as good as the participants. Wonderful turnout. We hope to be doing these events in the future as more details roll out, as the regulations get rolled out. We're going to be doing these again, so look at this space. Thank you to our panelists. Wonderful. We had a bit of a great discussion. Couldn't have done it without you. I thought we had a dream team up here today, so thank you all. Big round of applause.